Hello! Today I'm taking a brief look at another unique summon in Final Fantasy X, which is that of Anima. Now, Anima is an interesting one, as it's probably the first summon that, rather than relying on any inherent aesthetic or thematic or functional reference to real-world religions, mythologies, art or pop culture, it resides uniquely within the world of Final Fantasy, and more so than that, is appended specifically to the psychology and circumstances of an in-game character, which is that of Seymour Guado. So, I've discussed Seymour at length in the past, in a dedicated episode, and what is quite interesting about his backstory and his emotional disposition beyond the overtly villainous and nihilistic aims that he exhibits during the game is how we can piece together impressions of him that paint perhaps a slightly more sympathetic or deep character when we look at the symbolism of certain things, and Anima is a core component of that, I think. Now, just for a little context, what we learn in Final Fantasy X is that Seymour was the product of a Guado and human union between Lord Driscoll, leader of the Guado, and his human mother, who remains unnamed. And this was arguably an overtly political union that was meant to improve Guado-human relations and bring the former tribe into the fold of Yevon. However, the upshot of this union is that Seymour was rejected by both Guado and human, and effectively exiled to the Isle of Baj along with his mother, and she in turn encouraged him to become a summoner, and she resolved to become his fayth, the summon Anima, and her intention here was for her son to gain acceptance and redemption in the world by defeating sin. So, the resulting Aeon, Anima, is potentially quite telling as to how this panned out. Seymour never fulfilled his pilgrimage and defeated sin, but rather became isolated and twisted on the Isle of Baj as a result of society's rejection and the subsequent loss of his mother. So we could argue that his own downturn and his mother's unfulfilled hopes and dreams are manifest in the Aeon, which, contrary to the light breezy world of Spira, is a very dark, demonic and tortured-looking beast that is chained up, anguished, and even in its attacks, which are called things like Pain and Oblivion, it seems to be physically hurt and bloodied in the process of performing these actions. So, taking a step forward and looking at the naming conventions and how they support this maternal anguish and torment that there appears to be in Anima, there's two key symbols that I discussed in my Seymour episode, the first of which is the psychological concept of the Anima and the Animus, as theorised by Carl Jung, and also, secondly, the Anima Sola, which is a Catholic concept and visual allegory of souls in purgatory. So looking first to Jung, he theorised that humans have unconscious aspects of the psyche that exhibit traits of the opposite sex, and specifically personally important members of the opposite sex, such as mothers, fathers, siblings, and so on. And as such, he described the Animus as the masculine traits that are present in a woman or female, and the Anima as the feminine traits of a man or male. Turning back to the Aeon Anima and Anima's relationship to Seymour, we can reasonably assume and draw the dots to the Jungian symbolism here, with the Aeon being conjured by Seymour's mother as the fayth. We could argue that it's like his psychological Anima, and thus representative of the unconscious feminine aspect of himself that has manifested in the act of summoning. And as I've touched on, this harrowing appearance of Anima could be down to Seymour's grief over his mother's death, his inner twisted nature, or indeed his mother's own grief that's become manifest about what's become of her son. Another interesting point is the lower half of Anima, which has its own kind of torso, arms and head, and this only emerges during the Oblivion limit break, and this aspect of the Aeon could reasonably be considered as the Animus, either of Seymour's mother or of Seymour himself. And the reason I say that is that both the Anima and the Animus are like yin and yang, they're interconnected, but they're also regarded as personality types that not only represent different sexes, but also different characteristics. And while the Anima is more nurturing, emotive, and in Seymour's case, clearly tortured, the Animus exhibits a temperamental and potentially violent nature, and based purely on the chaotic violence of the Oblivion attack, I think it could perhaps be representative of this Animus part of the psyche, if we follow the Jungian ideas. Turning to the Catholic symbolism, the Anima Sola, or Lone Soul, is a religious imagery that depicts a woman in purgatory, and once again it is a female symbol, so again perhaps referential to Seymour's mother. And the Anima Sola is most often depicted bound in chains in a field of fire, so again looking at Anima, the Aeon, who is equally bound in chains, and equally, it seems, in some sort of eternal torment. I think there's clear connotations to this sort of symbolism too, along with the aforementioned psychological aspect of Carl Jung. So, very interesting Aeon here, and in all, I think Anima struck a chord and perhaps stood out to fans, in no small part due to its unique appearance and delivery, and indeed how, rather than the conventions and source materials usually referenced by Final Fantasy, such as mythology and that sort of thing, it took a thoroughly different and much more personal, character-specific and introspective approach to how it should appear in form and function. And as I say, I can't help but feel that it elicits a more tragic aspect of Seymour's character. And while yes, Seymour is irredeemable and unsalvageable by the time Final Fantasy X rolls around by having committed patricide and all these various evil acts that he does, I do think Anima as a summon is much more significant than it first appears, and it does hint at this underlying sorrow of a lost mother and a wasted life that gives much more dimensionality, three-dimensionality, to Seymour than perhaps it initially seems. So there we have it, my brief thoughts on Anima. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you haven't already, please consider sharing, subscribing, and drop a comment below to share your thoughts on Anima and the Final Fantasy summons.